So I want to address this really quickly because a lot of people say, but wasn't saturated fat vindicated? Did anybody see the headlines that saturated fat has been vindicated? Butter is back. You don't have to worry about saturated fat at all anymore. Well, there were 2 studies that suggested we don't have to worry about saturated fat. And one was an analysis by Siri Torino, and the other was an analysis by Chowdhury. And I've highlighted in yellow here a few names that were involved with these trials. Frank Hu, Francesca Crow, Dr. Mossafarian, Dr. Angelino or something. Anyway, we'll see it in bigger and then I'll be able to say it. So I can't read it so well there. But here's the headlines we saw. Saturated fat isn't bad for your heart. You know, saturated fat may not cause heart disease, not so bad after all, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the people at Harvard said the media misrepresented and sensationalized these study results, contributing to a haze of confusion among consumers. And they brought together a group of nutrition experts to do a teach-in. And in that were Frank Hu, who was an author of the first study, Dr. Mossafarian, who was an author of the second study, Frank Sachs, Alice Lichtenstein, who wrote the position paper for the American Heart Association, and Walter Willett again. And here's what the panel consensus was. Cutting back on saturated fat is good for health if the saturated fat is replaced with good fats, especially polyunsaturated fats. If you replace saturated fats with refined carbohydrates, like sugar, there will be a detrimental effect. Food quality matters. We've got to focus on food sources and dietary patterns rather than nutrients alone. And they basically determined that saturated fat increases LDL and HDL, but with an overall negative effect on cardiometabolic risk. So they're saying it's not good. Replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat lowers risk. Trans fat increases risk significantly. Refined carbs, adverse effects. Monounsaturated fat, uncertain effects. And unrefined carbohydrates, favorable effects. And Dr. Walter Willett did this little diagram. You replace saturated fat with trans fat, the worst possible outcome. With refined carbs, the next worst. With monounsaturated fat, not so bad. With unrefined carbohydrates, much better. And with polyunsaturated vegetable fat, much better as well. Here's what Dr. Hu said. And remember, he was an author of the first study that vindicated saturated fat. Dietary recommendations should be food-based, replacing high saturated fat foods such as red and processed meats and butter with vegetable oils, high in monos and PUFAs or polyunsaturated fats, nuts, seeds, legumes, and whole grains. There's a world-renowned expert who was interviewed about this whole saturated fat fiasco. And he says the fact that saturated fat raises cholesterol is beyond doubt. That has been shown in hundreds of trials that fed people different types of fat. The observational studies, he's talking about these 2 studies, sometimes do not show a link for 2 main reasons. Reason number 1, the differences in saturated fat intake within populations are too small to produce an effect. So if you compare someone eating 12% of calories from saturated fat with someone eating 14% of calories from saturated fat, you won't see huge differences. The dietary data is inaccurate in a lot of these studies. You know what they do? They often do one 24-hour recall, what did you eat yesterday, and then follow the people for 10 years. And do no other dietary assessments. None. 0. Yeah, it's shocking. It's shocking. The meta-analysis, and again, the meta-analysis included in the second trial, the Chowdhury trial, gave people margarine that was high in trans fats. When the authors omitted that trial, they found that people who replaced saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat actually had a 19% lower risk of heart disease. But the meta-analysis buried that finding in a supplement after they were challenged that didn't make the headlines. 19 out of the 20 studies compared populations with almost no variation in saturated fat intake. And this is very interesting. The rate of cardiovascular disease in Finland, where there's very high saturated fat intake, was 4.4 times higher than that of Japan, which was in this study in the same meta-analysis. But they didn't show that because they only looked at differences within each population. So the Japanese people, that some of were eating 6% of calories from saturated fat and some 8, they didn't see any difference. In Finland, 15 versus 17, they didn't see any difference. If they would have compared between the different populations, they would have seen a huge difference. Okay, and EPIC Oxford was the only study in that trial, the only study used in the meta-analysis that included a wide range. You know the wide range. The non-vegetarians, the vegetarians, the vegans, etc. They found a 2.77 times greater risk in those with the lowest or the highest saturated fat intake versus the lowest saturated fat intake. So that tells you something as well. Now this is very interesting because I actually emailed one of the authors of the Chowdhury study and I said, what's with this study? It just doesn't make sense based on what we know. She wrote me back and she explained to me that she had been very involved with the study when it was first done, and she said they found a big difference in people eating the most saturated fat versus the least saturated fat. But when they submitted it to a journal, it was not accepted. There was nothing new. So the lead author took and reworked the data, taking out some of the studies, like the one you saw on the last slide, resubmitted it with a little different finding, and it got accepted. And she said when it was sent back to her, she said it was within a week of being published, and there was nothing she could do. And here's what she said. The best available evidence from randomized controlled trials shows that saturated fat intake affects blood cholesterol levels, which is an important risk factor for heart disease. Therefore, current guidelines should still recommend that people minimize their intakes of saturated fat. And what do people recommend? Well, the American College of Cardiology and the American Heart Association recommend that people aim for a dietary pattern that achieves 5 to 6% of calories from saturated fat. You're basically talking a plant-based diet. You cannot get down to 5 to 6% of calories from saturated fat if you're not eating a plant-based diet. And their level of evidence was the strongest level of evidence that exists. Okay, and that's our conservative organizations. So what about heart disease reversal? Well, we know, and I won't go into detail, but you know Dr. Caldwell-Esselstyn has shown heart disease reversal using a low-fat plant-based diet, as has Dr. DEAN ORNISH. Both of Dr. Esselstyn showing 72% of those tested getting reversal, and Dr. Ornish finding 82% with reversal. And Dr. Esselstyn just put out a study in 2014 that was quite interesting. 198 patients with severe cardiovascular disease. 177 adhered to his program. 21 were non-adherent. The recurrence rate was 0.6% among the adherent people, and it was 62% among the non-adherent. And you know, this study wasn't a good study. It was a self-selected group, there was no control, it wasn't randomized, all of that stuff, but nonetheless, it's very interesting and very powerful findings. This cartoon says, heads you get a quadruple bypass, tails you eat your veggies. And I think the point here is you have a choice, you know, in your treatment for cardiovascular disease, and you have a choice in avoiding cardiovascular disease altogether. The take-home message is whole food, plant-based diets protect against cardiovascular disease, and well-designed plant-based diets can provide more effective treatment than our most powerful medications and surgeries. Cancer. The World Cancer Research Fund and the American Institute for Cancer Research probably put out the most comprehensive documents ever written on diet and cancer. And in 2007, they put out this Food, Nutrition, Physical Activity, and the Prevention of Cancer, a Global Perspective. And it involved over 100 scientists from 30 different countries around the world. And what's really interesting is they have an independent group of scientists that updates recommendations on an ongoing basis. This is called the Continuous Update Project. So we're getting, they keep looking at the research and updating us on diet and cancer. And they have a series of goals and recommendations, and they basically say that they believe that populations and people who achieve these recommendations will not only reduce the risk of cancer, but reduce the risk of many other diseases as well. And there are 2 recommendations that have anything to do with our plant intake and our intake of animal foods and plant foods. And they are, under plant foods, eat mostly foods of plant origin, eat at least 5 servings or 400 grams of a variety of non-starchy vegetables and fruits every day, eat relatively unprocessed cereal grains and or pulses or legumes with every meal, and limit refined starchy foods. And people who consume starchy roots and tubers like potatoes, make sure that they have sufficient non-starchy vegetables, fruits, and pulses or legumes as well. The justification for this recommendation: most diets that are protective against cancer are made up of foods of plant origin. And if you look at this list, this is inside the book, they list vegetables, fruits, pulses, nuts, seeds, herbs, spices, and the risk of cancer. You can see the decreases risk column and the increases risk column. There is nothing in the increases risk column. These foods don't increase risk based on the studies we have, but they seriously reduce risk. And there was one finding that was upgraded. Foods with fiber reduce risk of colon cancer or colorectal cancer went from probable to convincing in 2011. Animal foods, what do they say? Limit intake of red meat and avoid processed meat. People who eat red meat to consume less than 500 grams a week, very little, if any, to be processed. Justification: red and processed meats are convincing or probable causes of some cancers. And here's meat, poultry, fish, eggs, and the risk of cancer. You can see in the decreases risk column, the only thing there is fish for colorectal cancer. You can see in the increases risk convincing evidence for red and processed meat and colorectal cancer, and probable or limited or suggestive evidence for several other cancers. There have been about 7 meta-analyses that have looked at unprocessed red meat and cancer in 2012 to 2014. And you can see basically, this is unprocessed red meat, increasing risk of a variety of cancers between about 10 and about 20 or 30%. Total red meat increasing risk about 45%. Here's processed red meat and cancer, increasing risk about 15 to 25% per serving. The American Institute of Cancer Research estimated that about 45% of colorectal cases could be prevented if we all ate more fiber-rich plant foods and less meat, drank less alcohol, moved more, and stayed lean. So what are the rates among veg populations, vegetarians and vegans? Well, Epic Oxford compared to similar health-conscious non-vegetarians, cancer rates were 19% lower among vegans, 12% lower among pesco-vegetarians, and 11% lower among lacto-ovo-vegetarians. So you can imagine, this is compared to health-conscious meat eaters. Imagine what it would be if it were compared to non-health conscious meat eaters, the average Western diet eaters. It would probably be 50 or 60% lower. The Adventist Health Study 2, again, almost 70,000 participants. Compared to non-vegetarians, cancer risk was 16% lower among vegans, 12% lower among pesco-vegetarians, and 8% lower among lacto-ovo-vegetarians. 2012 meta-analysis, the same 7 studies that I talked about before. The results showed cancer incidence and mortality rates were 18% lower among vegetarians compared with non-vegetarians. So why the veg advantage? Well, plant-based diets have been shown to inhibit cancer cell growth, reduce DNA damage, improve DNA repair, lower IGF-1 levels or insulin-like growth factor 1 levels, favorably alter fecal enzymes and gut microflora, and reduce levels of a variety of toxic metabolites. So what about soy? And we talked a little bit about soy yesterday, but I want to talk about the weight of the evidence for soy and cancer. The American Institute of Cancer Research had a press release in 2012, and this is what the press release said. For all cancers, human studies show soy foods do not increase cancer risk, and in some cases may even lower it. Breast cancer patients and survivors need no longer worry about eating moderate amounts of soy foods. So here's what we know about soy and breast cancer. In a 2014 meta-analysis, soy consumers in Asia had a 41% risk reduction. No association was noted in Western countries in this meta-analysis. In 2012, there was a pooled analysis of Chinese and American women. Those with the highest intakes of isoflavones, and that is the phytoestrogen in soy, were 17% less likely to die from breast cancer and 25% less likely to have a recurrence of breast cancer. I think this study is one of the most interesting. This is a study from Korea, 2013. People with the highest quartile of soy intake had a 61% lower risk if they were BRCA1 or BRCA2 carriers. And the people with the highest quartile of meat intake had 197% higher risk, regardless of their BRCA status, whether or not they were BRCA positive. So very, very interesting. So soy was very protective, and the highest quartile of soy was actually 4 to 5 servings a day. Soy intake in childhood, moderate soy consumption in childhood, adolescence, and throughout puberty actually reduces lifetime breast cancer risk. So what about soy and prostate cancer? Well, a 2014 systematic review and meta-analysis reported that high-risk men, intake of soy or soy isoflavones reduced risk of prostate cancer by 51%. Preliminary evidence suggests that soy actually reduces prostate cancer metastases, slows rise in PA, reduces side effects also from radiation therapy. The take-home message here is populations eating plant-based diets have lower cancer rates, and plant-based diets have people eating plant-based diets lower several metabolic risk factors for cancer.